Okay, so video lecture 2 for week 3. We're going to get started with the Constitutional Convention. Anybody who's interested in reading more about the Constitutional Convention, I think the best work on this is by Carol Birkin. Her work, A Brilliant Solution. Her History of the United States, her textbook is actually the one that I have used in other classes. I think she's one of the best authors out there, and she really brings the Constitutional Convention home, explains it very well. Now, after the Revolution, Americans had established a new government. American exceptionalism. This is an example of American exceptionalism. No other country forged its own new country this way. No other country had to create a new constitution out of nothing, really. So this is one example, and there are many examples. Some people look at it negatively. I look at American exceptionalism as how America was essentially different from other countries in their development. Not that we were the best country, that we're better than everybody else, but how we are different. And there are many examples. Manifest Destiny, later in the term, we'll talk about that. That was another example of how we were exceptional or different from other countries. Doesn't mean better, means different. Now, after the revolutions, Americans, again, had to establish this new government. Initially, they tried the Articles of Confederation, and as we've discussed, this did not work out too well. The extreme focus on states' rights and decentralized government weakened the states as a whole and left them quite vulnerable, so it was back to the drawing board. What the Constitutional Convention shows is that there were still many different interests in the new republic, great diversity on key issues. It shows that there were still many questions to be answered. Again, this was a new experiment. It had never been done before in this capacity, and they needed to figure out just how to come up with the ideal solution. And again, it shows the importance of compromise, a word that I will state many times this term. With these varied interests, compromise, then, just like today, was absolutely necessary to make any progress whatsoever. This is a major theme throughout our history, but again, it becomes increasingly important after we establish our own country. We see it at the convention, and we will see it during the Revolution of 1800, and of course, in the many issues that would lead to the Civil War. Now, what were some of the questions that needed to be answered at the convention? Should there simply be a revision of the Articles, for example, or should an entire new constitution be drawn up? How to balance power between the central government and the states? How to balance power between the states themselves? How to finance the government and its needs? The Virginia Plan was presented as one option to the delegates. It was designed by James Madison and Virginia planner and former governor Edmund Randolph. The key question that drove these discussions was how to provide for a central government but restrict its power, to specifically avoid the tyranny of a crown while avoiding the relative anarchy of the Articles. Based on the idea of a balance of power as created by Baron de Montesquieu, a huge intellectual figure in Western history and very much part of the foundation of the Constitution, Madison and Randolph proposed a government with three distinct branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial, to replace the Confederation's Congress, which was at the time performing all three functions. The goal was to prevent any one person or branch from garnering too much authority. But there was still a major question: how to represent the states in the legislative branch. Madison proposed two houses, membership in both houses based on proportional representation. So the more people you have, the more representatives you have. Now, what's wrong with this plan? Of course, it provides a great advantage to larger states, and it would marginalize the smaller states. The New Jersey plan somewhat rectified this, but went to the other extreme. Each state was to have an equal voice and vote. This led to a great debate. The Great Compromise proposed a two-house legislature to satisfy both sides, with proportional representation in the lower house, or the House of Representatives, and equal representation in the upper house, or the Senate. Now, this, of course, is kind of similar to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but different, similar but different. A second important compromise came about regarding how representatives in each house would be selected. It was decided that state legislatures would select senators, and eligible voters of each state would directly elect members of the House. The election of senators, thus acknowledging the sovereignty of the state governments, or the legislatures that were, again, voted in by the people, the House reflecting the nature of a republic. This upset many nationalists or federalists because they wanted to keep the states out of the National Assembly altogether, but they compromised because they recognized the will of the convention. Now, some of you may think, oh my gosh, the legislatures are electing the senators. What about the people? Once we hit progressive America in the 20th century, there would be direct election of senators. Take part 2 of the course. We'll get into it. That kind of surprises some people because we always think of these representatives being elected throughout our history, but this was a recent phenomenon with regard to senators. Now, a third issue that required compromise: how to determine a state's population. Those in the South, of course, wanted to count slaves as population, as people, not as property. Quite pragmatic, right? Slaves made up as much as 1/3 of some state populations. Those in the North argued that slaves should be considered property. Again, think of the irony of this. In the South, they consider slaves property, but when it comes to representation, they're people. In the North, many, I wouldn't say all, but maybe I should say some Northerners believed slaves were actually people. They were not property. But for the sake of representation, they are property. So, again, when it comes to politics, people mess things up all the time because it helps them. And you could call it pragmatism, you could call it selfish, I don't know. This was, again, so that they could dominate the House of Representatives. Now, the North versus the South. This was a division in our nation that has existed from the earliest days. Yes, slavery was part of this, but the tariff, taxation, states' rights, many other specific and larger issues would also perpetuate this division. But the North, again, wanted slaves counted as property because there were many more people in the North, especially when you take slaves out of the equation. The 3/5 compromise was made. Slave populations were to count as 3/5 in the head count for representation in the House. Another key issue, of course, the executive branch of the government. For many, this was a scary proposition, as it could facilitate the move toward having a king. But for others, there was a sense such a position was necessary to unite the nation. George Washington was one of those in favor. He was relatively quiet during the convention, but when this issue came up, he was quite vociferous and ultimately influential. He had led the military during the Revolution, and for many there was an acquiescence to the idea he would become the first president. Another major issue, which I had mentioned in the first video lecture, was the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. Some at the convention did not believe this was necessary, as the rights were inherent in the rest of the Constitution. That was the argument. There were basic rights which could not be infringed upon. Again, natural rights, what I had talked about in the first lecture. But for others, this was seen as a nation of individuals. Again, get back to the idea of individualism. The rights of the individual were held dear, and they were considered more important than the rights of groups or states or regions. They deserved specific recognition as they were essential for all Americans. These 10 amendments would be passed and added to the Constitution in December of 1791. Again, the Federalists begrudgingly accepted these, but they did because they knew otherwise the Constitution would simply not be ratified. Now, when the convention was over, Benjamin Franklin left after the final day of deliberation. A woman approached him and asked, "What do we have, a republic or a monarchy?" Franklin's famous reply, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, Franklin's honesty about the proceedings was quite refreshing. He was pragmatic in his conclusions regarding the Constitution, summing it all up very well during his speech and trying to persuade representatives to support it. Now, one other thing that we need to keep in mind, Franklin and the other founders did not think that this Constitution would last very long. They thought it would last, of course. They knew it was important. But if you would have asked them back then if in 2018 we would still be using the same Constitution, they would have been pretty surprised, I think. Now, it does not take away the rational thought behind it, but again, they did not think that it would last this long. Now, let's get to a few important elections. First, the election of 1796, which was to pit two parties against each other at the local and national levels. These parties were aligned according to the issues we had discussed earlier: Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, or Democratic Republicans, as they were now called. The wealthy commercial elite, which were the Federalists, or what we consider Democrats today, and the more diverse agricultural interests of the Democratic Republicans. It was an intense battle and featured a clash between two of the leading founding fathers, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Not surprisingly, New England favored Adams while the southern states favored Jefferson. The mid-Atlantic states were key, and Adams ended up with a narrow victory of 71 to 68. Of course, we're talking about electoral votes, because electoral votes are the only thing that matters. Note, the runner-up in the election served as vice president, so it was Adams with Jefferson as vice president. This did not lead to amity in politics, though. Each side retained its core ideals. Adams faced many issues. First and foremost, the Republic was still a fledgling nation with little experience and even less international respect. John Jay's treaty had been viewed as an Anglo-American alliance by the French, who then suspended diplomatic relations with the U.S. and would seize over 300 ships over the next 2 years. Further humiliating the Americans was the XYZ affair. Adams said sent a diplomatic mission to France, but the mission was informed that to enter into negotiations, the U.S. would have to loan the French government money and pay a bribe to the agents themselves. Ooh. The U.S. would now outwardly support Great Britain, serving as an unofficial ally. A quasi-war with France would ensue from 1798 to 1800. Again, not a real war. Adams did make one mistake with his anti-French measures, his proposal of the Alien and Sedition Acts. These repressed any type of domestic protest against the government's actions. New powers made it easier to deport foreigners, and it made it more difficult for immigrants to vote. They now had to reside in the United States for 14 years instead of just 5. This was passed by the Federalist Congress. Notably, many foreigners or new immigrants had been supporters of the Democratic Republican. The Sedition Act essentially prohibited public opposition to the government. One could be fined or imprisoned if they were to, quote, write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing, end quote, against the government. Well, that could be many things, right? This led to the arrest of over 20 Republican newspaper editors. Even Vermont Representative Matthew Lyon was imprisoned for criticizing Adams in public. No matter, his constituents reelected him from his jail cell. Democratic Republicans appealed to state legislatures. Virginia and Kentucky would both essentially nullify the laws, declaring them invalid within their own states. Now remember this term nullification. Think about its potential ramifications, because we're going to get to it in the 1820s, and then that will really provide a precursor of sorts for what we see in the Civil War. All of this would come to a head with the Revolution of 1800. Now, the Revolution of 1800 was not a revolution as we might deem it. There was no taking over the government. This was a peaceful transition, and the first peaceful transition of power in Western history. This would also usher in Jeffersonian America. Again, this ideal of the yeoman farmer, of individualism, of self-reliance. The Revolution of 1800 would reignite many of the tensions from the convention. Adams ran for a second term as a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson ran as a Democratic Republican, or again, anti-Federalist if you go by the Federalist terminology. There was an electoral tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. And the Federalists were up in arms. They believed a Democratic Republican president would destroy all that the nation had built, that the election of either would certainly be the ruin of the country. Sound familiar? Alexander Hamilton did not like either. He did not like Jefferson, and he did not like Burr, but he believed Jefferson the lesser of two evils, and he would politic to win the presidency for Jefferson, leaving Burr behind. Now, this is important because Hamilton did not like Jefferson. He did not like him personally. He did not like his ideals either. Again, these are people on completely different sides of the political fence. But Hamilton, recognizing compromise was important, and recognizing that this election was important in the nation's future, and that the nation would be torn apart if there was not a compromise made, he goes out on a limb, he sticks up for Jefferson, Jefferson gets elected. Now this, I have many criticisms of Hamilton, but this was a very brave move, it was a noble move, he gave up his political future for it, but again, he realized the country was more important than just his political fortunes or just this presidency. Now, Burr, of course, would later challenge Hamilton to a duel. He would shoot him, he would kill him, so maybe Hamilton was right about Burr. Again, this shows the importance of compromise. Each party believed the other represented the worst of American politics, that the other would destroy the nation. Again, sound familiar? But in the end, the most ardent of Federalists stuck up for an anti-Federalist, believing the unity of the nation, however tenuous, was more important than his political party having power. And guess what? The nation survived, just as it will today.